I never told my son. I make $80,000 a month. His wife screamed, "Get out, you beggar, we don't need you." My son threw my things out the door. A month later, I bought the house across the street. When he saw my name on the deed. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellis, and I was 68 years old when my son threw my suitcase onto the front porch like it was a bag of old newspapers. But let me start before that night. Let me start where things still felt, at least on the surface, like family. I had spent the better part of my adult life building something quietly. After my husband Harold passed, God rest him, I was 51 years old, alone in our house in Boise, Idaho, with a mortgage, a garden, and absolutely no intention of sitting down and grieving myself to death. Harold had been a careful man, a saver, and he left me with a foundation. I built the rest myself. I started with an online resale business, vintage furniture, estate finds, things people threw away that still had life in them. Then I expanded into digital consulting for small antique dealers who had no idea how to sell online. By the time I was 65, I was earning close to $80,000 a month. Not a year. A month. I never told anyone. Not my neighbors. Not my church friends. And certainly not my son Daniel. I want to be clear about why. Harold always said, "Money changes the people around you before it changes you." I had watched it happen to his sister when she inherited their mother's estate. I didn't want to be looked at differently. I didn't want to be a wallet with a grandmother's face. So I lived modestly. I drove a 2017 Honda CR-V. I wore clothes from Costco and the occasional splurge at Chico's. My house in Boise was paid off, simple and full of plants. Daniel was my only child. We were close, or I believed we were close, until he married Brittany Caldwell 4 years ago. Brittany was 34, 12 years younger than Daniel, and she had a way of standing in a room that suggested she was always calculating the square footage. She was not unkind in the beginning, she was careful. There is a difference. An unkind person lets you see their edges. A careful person keeps them hidden until the moment they decide you're no longer useful. The first warning sign came 6 months into their marriage, during Thanksgiving. I had driven up to their home in Portland, a lovely craftsman house Daniel had bought before Brittany, thank God, and I noticed that the photo of Harold and me from Daniel's college graduation had been moved from the living room mantel to a closet shelf. When I asked Daniel about it, he said Brittany was redoing the aesthetic. I smiled and helped with the cranberry sauce. The second warning sign came the following Easter. Brittany made a comment at dinner, lightly, with a laugh, the way people say things they mean, about how it must be so hard living alone on a fixed income. I was sipping my iced tea. I said nothing. Fixed income. I was running 4 revenue streams at the time. The third warning sign came when Daniel called me in October and suggested, gently, carefully, the way Brittany had taught him to be gentle and careful, that I consider selling my Boise house and moving in with them. They had a guest room. It would be easier for everyone. I should have heard the word easier and asked, easier for whom? But I was lonely. That is the truth I am not ashamed of. Harold had been gone 17 years and the evenings were long, and Daniel was my son, my boy, the child I had raised alone after Harold's first heart attack left him half present for years. I said yes. I moved to Portland in January. I brought my plants, my laptop, my external hard drives. My entire business lived on those drives. And 2 boxes of Harold's things I couldn't part with. I paid no rent. I offered to, repeatedly. Daniel said it wasn't necessary. Brittany said nothing, which I later understood was her loudest language. The first 3 weeks were pleasant enough. Then the pleasantness wore thin. Brittany began making comments about my schedule. I worked early mornings, 4 to 8 a.m., before the house woke up. She said the keyboard noise carried. I bought a quieter keyboard. She said the light from my laptop bothered her when she passed the hallway. I started working with the door closed. She said she could hear me on calls. I began using earphones and whispering. I was shrinking. I could feel it. And still I told myself, she is adjusting. This is new for everyone. Daniel loves you. Give it time. Then came the evening of March 14th. I had been on a call with a client in London. It ran long, 20 minutes past what I'd planned. When I came out of the guest room, Brittany was standing in the hallway. Her arms were crossed. Daniel was behind her, and I noticed he was not looking at me. "Margaret," Brittany said. She never called me Mom, not once. "We need to talk about boundaries." I said, of course, and I followed them to the kitchen. What happened next took 11 minutes. I counted them later, lying awake, because that is what you do when your mind needs to measure a wound. Brittany spoke about how this arrangement wasn't working, how I was always underfoot, how the guest room was actually meant to be a home office for her growing candle business, how they had been more than generous. And then she said it. The thing from the title of this story, the thing I will never forget as long as I live. "You're a poor woman living off our hospitality. We don't need a penniless old lady taking up space in our home. Pack your things." I looked at my son. Daniel looked at the kitchen floor, and then he walked to the guest room, and I heard him pulling my suitcase out from under the bed. I stood in that kitchen for exactly the amount of time it took me to decide I would not cry in front of Brittany Caldwell. That was the only decision I made in those first 60 seconds. Everything else, the grief, the disbelief, the specific pain of watching my son refuse to meet my eyes, I folded up and put somewhere behind my sternum, the way you press a letter into an envelope when you're not ready to send it yet. Daniel set my suitcase by the front door. Then he went back for my laptop bag. Then the 2 boxes of Harold's things. He stacked them neatly on the porch, which somehow made it worse. The neatness of it, the care he took arranging my whole life in a 4-foot pile on painted wood. It was 41 degrees outside. I know because I checked my phone as I stood there, because my mind was doing what it always does under pressure, collecting data. Brittany had not followed us to the door. She was already back in the kitchen. I could hear her filling the kettle. "Mom?" Daniel said. He was still not looking at me. "I'm sorry. This is just... it's not working." "You said that," I replied. "You can call me when you get settled." I picked up my laptop bag. I lifted the suitcase handle. I looked at my son. This man I had driven to every soccer practice, every orthodontist appointment, who I had held at 2 in the morning when Harold's heart gave out the first time and Daniel was 16 and terrified. And I said very quietly, "I will." Then I walked to my Honda and I drove. I drove for 20 minutes without knowing where I was going, which is not like me. I am a woman who has had a destination for most of her adult life. But that night, Portland moved past my windows like a city I'd never been to, all wet streets and yellow light, and I just drove until I found myself in the parking lot of a Marriott courtyard near the Lloyd District. I checked in for 3 nights. I paid cash from the emergency envelope I kept in my laptop bag. Harold's habit, passed to me. I went to my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, and I allowed myself exactly 45 minutes to feel everything. I cried for Harold first. I always do in the worst moments, because he would have known what to say and how to say it, and exactly when to put his hand on mine. Then I cried for Daniel, not the man who had stacked my boxes on a 41-degree porch, but the boy I'd raised, who I was now not sure I recognized. Then I cried for myself, briefly and practically, because I have never seen self-pity as a useful long-term activity. At the 46-minute mark, I washed my face, opened my laptop, and started a new document. I titled it, "What is True?" This is something I learned in business and in grief. When everything feels chaotic, establish the facts. So, I wrote them down. What is true? I am 68 years old. I am in good health. I have no mortgage. My business generated $79,400 last month. I have $2.3 million in savings and investments. I have been told I am a burden by a woman who has never asked me a single question about my life. My son did not defend me. I read it back twice. Then I wrote one more line. What is also true? I do not have to accept this as the end of anything. I spent the next 3 days in that hotel room doing 2 things simultaneously, grieving and planning. I let them run in parallel. In the mornings I worked, client emails, invoices, a new product listing for a Victorian secretary desk I'd sourced in October. In the afternoons, I made calls. I found a furnished apartment in the Irvington neighborhood, 2 miles from Daniel and Brittany's house, available month to month. I signed the lease on day 3. It was a good apartment, high ceilings, original hardwood floors, a kitchen window that looked out onto a maple tree. I paid 6 months up front, which made the landlord visibly relieved and completely uninterested in asking questions. I moved in with my suitcase, my laptop, my drives, and Harold's boxes. I bought groceries. I bought a new plant, a pothos, because they survive anything, and I put it in the kitchen window. And then I sat in my new living room on a rented couch, and I let myself think. Not feel. Think. Here is what I thought about. Brittany's face when she said, "penniless old lady." The specific satisfaction in it. The way she had said it like she was issuing a verdict she had prepared well in advance. And I thought about Daniel's silence, which was its own kind of verdict. They had decided who I was. They had built a version of me, small, dependent, a charity case in their Craftsman house. And they had evicted that version. The problem, for them, was that the version they had built had nothing to do with who I actually was. And that gave me an idea. A very specific, very deliberate idea. I opened my laptop and I went to Zillow. I typed in Daniel and Brittany's street address, Sycamore Lane, Portland, Oregon, and I looked at what was available in their neighborhood. There was one listing that stopped my scrolling. Directly across the street from their Craftsman home, I could see it in the listing photos, their blue front door visible in the background, was a 3-bedroom bungalow, gray with white trim, a covered porch, a big maple in the front yard, listed at $687,000. Available immediately, vacant, the seller motivated. I looked at that listing for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called my financial advisor. "Barbara," I said, "I need to talk about a real estate purchase." "Of course," she said. "Investment property?" "Personal residence," I said, and I gave her the address on Sycamore Lane. Barbara Nguyen had been my financial advisor for 11 years, and she had learned in that time not to ask me why I wanted something, only whether the numbers worked. "Give me 24 hours, she said. I'll pull the comps and look at your liquidity position. I already know my liquidity position, I said. I need you to confirm the purchase won't create any tax complications if I use the investment account. She paused. Margaret, that's a significant withdrawal. I know what it is, Barbara. Another pause. Then, I'll have everything ready by tomorrow morning. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called a real estate attorney named Patricia Howe, whom I'd found through the Oregon State Bar's referral directory. I had met Patricia once, briefly, at a Chamber of Commerce event 3 years earlier when I was scouting Portland as a possible base for my business. She was precise and unhurried, which are the two qualities I require most in a lawyer. I explained the situation in broad strokes. I wished to purchase a specific property, I intended to pay cash, and I needed the transaction handled with complete confidentiality regarding the buyer's identity until closing. That's not unusual for cash purchases, Patricia said. We can use a trust or LLC as the purchasing entity. A trust, I said. The Harold Ellis Family Trust. I had established that trust 8 years ago for estate planning purposes. Harold's name on it still gave me a particular kind of comfort, as though he were still co-signing my decisions from wherever he had gone. Patricia said she would begin the paperwork. I asked how quickly we could move to closing if the seller was motivated. Cash, no contingencies, motivated seller? 3 weeks, possibly 2. Make it 2, I said. Over the following days, I moved quietly. I drove past Sycamore Lane twice, not in front of the gray bungalow, but through the parallel alley, to look at the property from different angles. The bones were excellent. The roof looked newer. The backyard was overgrown, but had potential. There was a detached garage that, I noted, could serve as a workspace. The listing agent was a young man named Tyler, who seemed genuinely baffled that a cash buyer had materialized within 48 hours of the listing going live. I let him be baffled. I asked practical questions. Age of the HVAC system, any history of foundation issues, HOA status, no HOA. Good. I did not drive past Daniel and Brittany's blue front door. I did not need to. I had the listing photos, and in one of them, the wide shot of the bungalow's exterior, taken from the street. I could see their porch clearly, the 2 rocking chairs they kept there, the hanging fern Brittany was so proud of. The fern looked healthy. It wouldn't for much longer, I suspected. But that wasn't something I spent much time thinking about. It was during the 2nd week of this process, while Patricia was finalizing the purchase agreement and Barbara had confirmed the capital transfer, that I received the information that changed everything from a matter of dignity into a matter of record. I had a friend, Carol Simmons, 71, a retired school teacher who had lived 3 doors down from Daniel and Brittany for 6 years. Carol and I had met at Daniel's housewarming party before Brittany had fully consolidated her position, and we had stayed in touch. Monthly coffee when I visited Portland, occasional texts. Carol called me on a Thursday evening. "Margaret," she said without preamble, "I don't know if I should be telling you this." "Tell me," I said. Carol had been at a neighborhood book club 2 nights earlier. Brittany had not attended. Brittany never attended, but a woman named Sandra, who lived next door to Daniel and Brittany, had. And Sandra, apparently loosened by 2 glasses of Chardonnay, had mentioned something that she thought was common knowledge. Brittany had been planning Margaret's removal since October, not since the boundaries conversation in the hallway. Since October, 4 months before it happened, 4 months before I arrived with my plants and my laptop and Harold's boxes. Sandra had heard it directly from Brittany herself during a backyard conversation over the fence in November. Brittany had told Sandra that Daniel's mother situation would be resolved by spring. She had described the guest room as already spoken for. Her candle business, the home office, the plan she had outlined to Daniel. She said, and Sandra quoted this carefully because she had found it striking at the time, "She'll have no choice. She sold her house. Where is she going to go?" I sat very still on my rented couch. I had sold my Boise house in December, 3 months after Brittany had made that calculation. I had sold it because Daniel had convinced me, gradually, over several conversations, that I wouldn't need it anymore, that Portland was home now, that they wanted me there. Those conversations had begun in September, 1 month before Brittany told Sandra the situation would be resolved by spring. I understood now. The invitation hadn't been an invitation. It had been a procurement. Get the old woman to sell her house, eliminate her exit, then remove her on a timeline of our choosing. I asked Carol if Sandra would be willing to write down what she'd heard and sign it. "I think she would," Carol said quietly. "She felt terrible when she found out what happened to you. She didn't know it had already been carried out. Can you ask her for me?" "Yes," Carol said. "Margaret, are you all right?" I looked at the pothos in my kitchen window. It had put out 2 new leaves since I'd brought it home. "I am better than all right," I said. "I am informed." 2 days later, I had a signed, dated, notarized statement from Sandra Paulson, 47, of Sycamore Lane, Portland, Oregon, attesting to the conversation she had witnessed between Brittany Ellis and herself in November on the subject of Margaret Ellis's planned removal from the family home. Patricia added it to the file she was building, and on a gray Tuesday morning in early April, I signed the closing documents for the Harold Ellis Family Trust's acquisition of 14 Sycamore Lane, Portland, Oregon, the property directly across the street from my son's blue front door. I drove to the closing. I signed everything. I accepted the keys from Tyler, who still looked mildly bewildered. I drove to the property, unlocked the front door, walked through the empty rooms that smelled of old wood and possibility. I stood at the living room window and looked across the street. I could see their porch, the rocking chairs, the hanging fern. I thought, Daniel, when you see my name on that mailbox, I want you to understand something. This isn't revenge. This is a woman who you underestimated, showing you the cost of that error. Then I went to measure the windows for curtains. I didn't rush the move. I had learned in 68 years that the best actions are the ones executed without urgency, because urgency makes you sloppy, and sloppiness gives other people leverage. I hired a small moving company, 2 young men named Josh and Marcus, who worked efficiently and didn't ask personal questions. And over the course of a single Saturday, my life migrated from the Irvington apartment to 14 Sycamore Lane. I had bought several pieces of furniture in the interim weeks, a proper bed, a reading chair, a desk for my work setup, a kitchen table with 4 chairs I would likely only ever use for myself, but wanted anyway, because a table with 4 chairs says something different about a life than a table with one. I had also bought new curtains, linen, cream-colored for the living room windows that faced the street. I did not open those curtains on moving day. I wasn't ready for that yet. The discovery happened on Sunday morning, 31 hours after the moving truck left. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a car door close in a way that carried significance. Not the casual thump of a neighbor leaving for church, but the sharp, declarative slam of someone who has just seen something that made them forget to be careful. I looked through the kitchen window, which faced the side yard, and saw nothing. Then I heard footsteps on my porch. The knock was loud, the kind that is just barely, not a bang. I took my coffee with me to the door. I was wearing my good navy cardigan, the one with the brass buttons, Because I had dressed properly that morning as I always do. Another of Harold's lessons. How you dress tells you what kind of day you're going to have. I opened the door. Daniel and Brittany stood on my porch. Daniel looked like a man who had just discovered the ground was not where he thought it was. His face was doing three things at once: confusion, something almost like fear, and beneath it, working its way up, anger. Brittany's face was doing only one thing. Brittany's face was doing what it always did, calculating. "Mom," Daniel said. It was the first time I had heard his voice since he carried my boxes to a 41-degree porch. "Daniel," I said. "Brittany." I didn't offer them a smile. I didn't offer them anything. I held my coffee with both hands and waited. "What is this?" Brittany said. Her voice was controlled, but only just. "What are you doing?" "I live here," I said. "You bought this house?" Daniel said. "The Harold Ellis Family Trust did, yes?" A pause. Brittany's eyes moved from my face to the interior of the house behind me, cataloging, assessing, adding up what she saw and what it meant. I watched her do it. This is insane," she said. Then the control slipped, just slightly, and what came through was not anger, but something closer to panic dressed as anger. "You can't do this. You can't just move across the street from us." "I'm not aware of any ordinance that prevents it," I said. "Are you?" Daniel stepped forward. "Mom, this isn't... You're trying to make a point. I understand, but this is too far. You need to think about what you're doing." "I thought about it quite carefully," I said. "Over several weeks." "We want you to sell it," Brittany said. "We'll help you find something. Somewhere in Portland, somewhere comfortable, but not..." She gestured at the street, at the 12 yards between my porch and her blue front door. "Not here." "No, thank you," I said. Brittany's composure finally left her. It didn't leave gradually. It left all at once, the way a weather system breaks. "You're doing this to punish us," she said, her voice rising. "You're a vindictive old woman, and you're doing this to make our lives miserable, and I will not allow it. Do you hear me? I will not allow it." "Brittany," Daniel said quietly, but not to stop her, to warn her, which told me he could see what I could see, that she had lost the room. "You have no friends here," Brittany continued. "You have no community here. Nobody on this street wants a bitter old woman sitting in her window watching their house. You'll be miserable and alone, and when you finally come to your senses..." "Brittany." This time Daniel's voice had more edge to it. She stopped. She was breathing hard. I looked at my son. I said, "I have a document, signed and notarized, from a neighbor on this street, attesting to a conversation in which your wife stated that my removal from your home was planned 4 months before it occurred. During the same period you were encouraging me to sell my house in Boise. I shared that document with my attorney. It is in a file. I want you to know that it exists." The porch went very quiet. Daniel's face did something then that I hadn't expected. It cracked. Not in rage, in something that looked, briefly, like shame. Brittany was staring at me. The calculation was back in her eyes, but it was running slower now. Something had jammed the mechanism. "You have 2 choices," I said. "You can leave my porch and we can be neighbors, which will require nothing from you except basic civil behavior. Or you can continue this conversation in a direction that I promise you will find much more uncomfortable. What would you like to do?" They left. I closed my door. I went back to the kitchen, poured out the coffee that had gone cold, and stood at the sink for a long moment, with both hands gripping the edge of the counter. My heart was going faster than I would have liked. I was 68 years old, and I had just faced down my son and the woman who had engineered my homelessness, and I had done it cleanly. But the body doesn't always know the difference between winning and being in danger. My hands were trembling slightly. I allowed that. I spent the next 4 days doing almost nothing. I planted the backyard, bulbs, early perennials, some herbs along the fence. I read 3 novels. I watched the maple in my front yard change its light through the day. I did the minimum necessary for my business, and I let my clients' auto-responses handle the rest. I wasn't hiding, I was recharging. There is a crucial difference. On the 5th day after the porch confrontation, a basket appeared on my doorstep. It was a handsome basket. Wicker, lined with gingham, filled with artisanal items, a jar of local honey, 2 candles in amber glass, a packet of specialty tea, a small card in Brittany's handwriting that said, "Neighbors can have a fresh start, too." I looked at the basket for a long time. Then I photographed it, card and all, and sent the image to Patricia Howe with a note. For the file. I brought the basket inside because the honey was good quality, and I saw no reason to waste it. But I did not respond to the card. 2 days after the basket, Daniel called. I let it ring. Then I listened to the voicemail because I needed to know what register he was operating in. His voice was careful, apologetic in texture, but not quite apologetic in content. The difference between a person who is sorry and a person who is performing sorrow in hopes of a specific outcome. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking a lot. I want you to know that I hear you. I know things got out of hand. Brittany and I have talked, and we think maybe we all started off on the wrong foot. Can we try to move forward? I love you. Call me back." Started off on the wrong foot, as though he had stepped on my shoe at a party. As though I had not been maneuvered out of my home and my stability with months of deliberate planning. As though the notarized document didn't exist. I did not call back, not that day and not the next. What I did instead was knock on Carol Simmons's door. Carol lived at number 8 Sycamore Lane, 3 houses down from Daniel and 2 houses down from me. She opened the door in a flour-dusted apron and immediately stepped aside to let me in, which is the kind of person Carol is. She doesn't wait to decide if she's glad to see you. She's already glad before you finish knocking. We sat in her kitchen, which smelled of baking and old wood and the particular warmth of a house that has been genuinely lived in. She made tea without asking if I wanted any. She put out a plate of shortbread. I told her everything. Not the financial details. I am still a private woman. But everything about the basket and the voicemail and the signed statement and the house. Carol listened without interrupting, which is also rare and worth noting. When I finished, she set down her teacup and said, "You know what you did? You named yourself on that street. And names matter." "What do you mean?" "I mean Brittany has been the one who defined you on this block, since before you even moved in with them. She told people you were Daniel's elderly mother who needed looking after. She did it kindly, Margaret. She's good at kindness as a tool. But she defined you. And now you've shown up across the street in your own house with brass buttons on your cardigan, and you're defining yourself, and that frightens her." I thought about that. Carol introduced me to 3 other neighbors over the following week, organically, through walks and front yard conversations, and one spontaneous invitation to a Sunday potluck that 6 households on the block attended. There was Sandra, of course, who greeted me with the particular warmth of someone who is relieved to see you looking well. There was Jim, 64, a retired engineer who lived at the corner and seemed quietly delighted by anyone with strong opinions and a good handshake. There was Maria, 48, who ran a daycare from her home and observed everything on the street with a calm, comprehensive attention that I immediately respected. I did not speak about Daniel and Brittany directly. I didn't need to. I was simply present. I was a neighbor. I went to the potluck. I brought a lemon cake. I listened more than I spoke. and I let the street form its own opinion of me independently of the one Brittany had been preloading. It was at that potluck that Jim said, in the way that people say things that are both casual and deliberate, "Nice to finally meet you properly, Margaret. Daniel's been saying you were, well, you seem like you're doing just fine." "What did Daniel say I was?" I asked pleasantly. Jim glanced toward number 11, Daniel's house, and then back at me. "Struggling," he said. "He mentioned you'd had some financial difficulties." I smiled. I took a small sip of my lemonade. "How interesting," I said. And I said nothing else on the subject because I didn't need to. The house across the street said everything. I could see, from Jim's expression, that he was already revising his received information. Later that evening, I sat on my covered porch as the street quieted down for the night. The maple was doing something beautiful with the last of the light. I could see Daniel and Brittany's living room window, lit from inside, the shapes of them moving occasionally behind frosted glass. I was not watching them with malice. I want that to be clear. I was watching the way you watch weather. Not to control it, but to understand it. The basket had been Brittany's first probe, the voicemail Daniel's. Neither had landed. They would try again. People who have operated through control rarely stop cleanly when the first effort fails. They recalibrate. I was ready to be recalibrated against. In fact, I was counting on it. They came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the basket. I had been expecting them. Not on that particular Saturday, but in that general window. Brittany had a rhythm to her strategies. Probe, withdraw, recalibrate, advance. It was the rhythm of someone who was accustomed to winning through attrition. I had mapped it across the months I'd spent in their house, the small escalations and retreats, the way she would push until you softened, and then push again into the newly softened space. I saw them cross the street from my kitchen window. I had time to set down my coffee, smooth my cardigan, the same navy one, deliberately, and reach the door before they knocked. Daniel was carrying flowers, pale pink dahlias from what I could tell, wrapped in brown paper. Brittany was carrying a paper bag from the French bakery on Morrison Street, the expensive one. They had prepared. "Mom," Daniel said when I opened the door. His smile was the one I recognized from his childhood, the one he deployed when he'd broken something and was hoping hope would do the work of accountability. "Can we come in?" I considered it. I could have said no. Patricia would likely have preferred I said no. But I had learned something important over 68 years of managing people. The most revealing thing a person does is what they do when you give them an opening. So I said yes, and I stepped back from the door. We sat in my living room, which by then had taken on its proper character. The reading chair, the framed photograph of Harold and me from our trip to Oregon coast in 2003, the 2 good lamps that cast the room in warm light. I saw Brittany take in the room as she sat down. I saw the micro-adjustment in her face, the recalibration, as she processed that it was not what she'd expected. It was not the room of a woman who was struggling. "We've been thinking a lot," Daniel began. He was sitting forward on the sofa, flowers in his lap. Brittany was beside him, the bakery bag on her knees, her posture open and soft. She had practiced this posture. I could see its practice in it. About everything. About how things went. "And?" I said. "And we want to start over," Daniel said. We want things to be good between us. We're family." He held out the dahlias. I looked at them. I did not reach for them. "Daniel," I said, "I'd like to believe that. What does starting over look like specifically in your mind?" He glanced at Brittany. The glance was small and quick, but I had 40 years of reading my son's face, and it told me clearly. She wrote the answer. "It looks like everyone moving forward," Brittany said. Her voice was warm. It was remarkable. The warmth. Not manufactured, exactly, but applied. The way you apply a coat of paint to a surface. Not holding on to the past. Not. Her eyes moved briefly around the room, settling on the window that faced their house. Not making choices designed to create discomfort for other people. I chose a home I loved, I said. In a neighborhood I had already come to know. What's discomforting about that? Brittany's warmth adjusted slightly. Margaret, I think we both know that living directly across the street from your estranged son and his wife is not a neutral choice. I'm not estranged from my son, I said. He's welcome to call me. He left a voicemail 3 weeks ago. I heard it. You didn't call back, Daniel said. No, I agreed. I didn't. A pause. Daniel set the dahlias on the coffee table, gently, in what I recognized as a small act of grief. Brittany pressed forward. What would it take, she said, for you to consider a different arrangement? Something more, comfortable, for everyone. What you're asking me, I said, is to leave. We're asking you to think about what's best long-term, she said. At your age, being isolated from your family, in a house that's more than you need. At your age, there it was, the velvet scalpel. I'm not isolated, I said. I had dinner with Carol Simmons on Thursday. Jim from the corner helped me identify my maple last weekend. Maria's children wave at me every morning when she drops them at the bus stop. I'm less isolated here than I was in your guest room. Brittany's warmth cooled by several degrees. Margaret. She leaned forward very slightly. This situation isn't good for Daniel. For his stress, for his work, for... There are health implications to sustained family conflict. For everyone, including you. I looked at her. I let the silence hold for a full 5 seconds, which is a long time when you're sitting in someone's living room. Are you suggesting that my choice of residence is a health risk? I said. To whom? I'm suggesting, Brittany said, each word careful now, that living this way, watching each other across a street, it's not sustainable. And when things aren't sustainable, eventually, they collapse in ways that aren't good for anyone. Daniel had stopped speaking. He was looking at his hands. I have a different perspective, I said. I think things are quite sustainable. I have a home I own, a business that runs well, neighbors I've grown fond of, and a perfectly clear view of the street, which I find I enjoy. Brittany stood up. The warmth was entirely gone now. You're being willfully obstructive, she said. And childish. I'm being a homeowner, I said, which I have been for 37 years. We'll figure something out, she said. It was a threat in the structure of a sentence. Daniel stood, retrieved the dahlias. It was an automatic gesture, habitual, and it told me more than anything else that morning had told me. He had not expected to leave them here. He had expected a different outcome. At the door he turned. Mom, he said, please. I looked at my son, my boy, who I loved in the way you love something that has caused you your deepest pain and your deepest joy in equal proportion, inseparably. And I said, I'll be here, Daniel. I'm not going anywhere. They walked back across the street. I closed my door and stood in my hallway and acknowledged the fear. It was real. Brittany's last sentence had been designed to generate it, and it had worked in the way that a key works in a lock. It found the right mechanism and turned it. But here is what I also knew, standing in my hallway. Fear, when you don't run from it, doesn't empty you. It fills you. It fills you with the particular clarity of someone who understands exactly what is at stake. I went to my desk. I opened my laptop. I wrote a detailed account of the morning's conversation, time, duration, specific statements, and emailed it to Patricia. Then I worked for 4 hours straight, and I was very sharp that afternoon. The Block Association meeting had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. Jim organized them quarterly, rotating through neighbors' houses. This one was scheduled for the last Saturday of May at Maria's, which could accommodate 12 people comfortably in her large kitchen dining room. 7 households were attending. I had marked the date in my calendar the day Carol told me about it. I had not planned a scene. I want to be clear about that. What I had planned was to be present, to be myself, and to be prepared if a scene arrived on its own, which I had reason to believe it might. Daniel and Brittany attended. They arrived slightly early, which told me they wanted to establish themselves in the room before I got there. I arrived at the stated time with a lemon pound cake on a plate with a card that said, Margaret, number 14, which several people remarked was a lovely touch. I took a chair at the end of the table near Jim and Sandra. For the first 40 minutes, the meeting was about ordinary things. The pothole on the north end, the question of whether the old Henderson's oak needed a city permit before trimming, a proposal to organize a summer block party. I listened, contributed once on the question of the oak tree, and watched the room. Brittany was performing well. She was engaged, she laughed at the right moments, she touched Daniel's arm in ways that communicated partnership. She was, as Carol had said, good with the tools. But she had not accounted for Sandra. Sandra had not intended to say anything. She told me this afterward, carefully, over coffee. She had truly not intended to. But the combination of 2 glasses of the white wine Maria had put out, and the particular moment that arrived, the moment when Brittany said, in response to a question about the summer block party, it would be so nice for the whole neighborhood to feel like a real community, not just strangers living near each other, was more than Sandra could comfortably hold inside. I think community starts with honesty, Sandra said. Her voice was conversational, not pointed. She was looking at her wine glass, about who people are and what they've actually done. The table shifted slightly. These things happen in rooms, small atmospheric changes like a barometric drop. Brittany looked at Sandra. Absolutely, she said smoothly. I've been thinking about that, Sandra continued, since Margaret moved in across the street. It's an interesting thing. Someone told me Margaret was a woman in financial difficulty who needed looking after. And then she bought a house on our street for cash. A quiet moment. Jim said, Cash purchase? I said, pleasantly. The Harold Ellis Family Trust, yes. That's significant, Jim said, looking at me with the expression of a man thoroughly revising a database entry. Someone told you Margaret was struggling financially, Maria asked Sandra, not with aggression, with the particular directness of a woman who runs a daycare and has 0 patience for indirection. Sandra glanced toward Daniel, not toward Brittany, toward Daniel. It was a small thing, but rooms notice small things. Daniel was looking at the table. I may have repeated something I shouldn't have, he said quietly. Daniel, Brittany said. Her voice was controlled, just barely. It wasn't accurate, he said. He said it to the table, not to me. The table was quiet in the way tables go quiet, when everyone present has understood something and is waiting to see if anyone will say it. I said it. I built a business after my husband died, I said. I have been supporting myself entirely for 17 years. I mention this not for any point of pride, but because I think it's important for the people on this street to know who their neighbor actually is. I paused. There was a period when I was staying with Daniel and Brittany. It ended abruptly, in March, when I was told to leave. I found a place to stay. I took some time, and I bought this house. That's the whole story. A pause. Maria was looking at Daniel. Jim was looking at his wine glass, diplomatically. Brittany said, That is a very selective version of events. Then tell the less selective version, I said. Not with heat. With perfect evenness. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. What came out was, "You have no right to discuss our family's private." "You discussed my finances on this street," I said. "You described me as a woman in difficulty, which influenced how my neighbors saw me before I had the chance to introduce myself. I'm simply introducing myself now." "You planned this," Brittany said. Her voice rose. "You came here tonight to humiliate us." "I came here tonight because Jim organized a neighborhood meeting, and I live on this street," I said. "Brittany," Daniel said, low. "She's doing this on purpose, Daniel. She has been doing this on purpose since she moved in here. This is exactly what—" Her voice was climbing, and I watched the room watching her climb. And I watched the moment when Brittany understood. I could see it arrive behind her eyes. That she had lost the room. Not to me. To herself. She stopped. The room was very quiet. Jim said gently, "Maybe we should take a short break." Brittany stood up. She walked out of Maria's house without looking at anyone. Daniel followed her, and at the door he paused and looked back at me. A long, complicated look that I will spend more time understanding in the years ahead than I will spend on almost anything else. Then he went after her. The table sat in silence for a moment. Then Sandra topped up my wine glass. Maria put the plate of cookies in front of me. Jim said, "So, the pothole." And the meeting continued. The Block Association meeting had occurred on a Saturday. By Tuesday, it had become, in the quiet way of neighborhoods, a piece of shared knowledge, discussed over back fences and in parked cars and during long front porch conversations. Patricia called on Wednesday. "I want to prepare you for something," she said. "If Daniel and Brittany decide the notarized statement represents a legal threat, they may try to file something. Harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress. A weak case. But weak cases still take time." "Let them," I said. "You're sure?" "Patricia, I have documentation of a deliberate scheme to eliminate my housing security. I have a notarized witness statement. I have the timeline of my selling my Boise house running parallel to the timeline of their plan. If they want to put any of this in front of a judge, they're welcome to." They did not file anything. A courthouse is a room where documents become evidence, and Brittany understood that better than Daniel did. Daniel came to my door on Friday evening. Alone. He looked tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. He was not carrying flowers. I made 2 cups of tea. I put one in front of him. I sat across from him. "She didn't know you'd bought the house," he said finally. "She told me it wasn't possible. She said you didn't have that kind of money." "I know she thought that," I said. "She told me you were struggling, that the Boise house sale was, that you were in debt." He stopped. I believed her. "How long did you know about the plan?" I asked. "The October timeline." He looked at the table. "I knew she wanted the room back. I knew it was coming. I didn't know about October." "But you knew it was coming," I said. "Yes. And you let it come." "Yes." That was the word I had needed, not an excuse, not a context. Just, yes. "Daniel," I said, "I love you in a way that isn't negotiable. You are my son, and that is permanent. But I will not pretend that what was done to me was an accident. It was a plan. Brittany built it, and you consented to it." "I know," he said. "What happens next between us depends entirely on whether you can be honest about that, with me and with yourself. Not on Brittany's timeline, honestly." He was quiet a long time. Then, "She's been different lately, since the meeting." "That's between you and her," I said. "That's not my chapter." He nodded, thanked me for the tea with the specific politeness of someone reaching for a behavior long out of reach, and walked back across the street. What followed arrived in pieces through Carol and Sandra. Brittany began separating their finances in June. A family attorney in the Pearl District, not a couples counselor. The candle business she had cited as the reason my room was needed had generated approximately $1,200 in the prior year. Daniel called me in August and asked if we could have dinner. We went to a small Italian place on Alberta Street and talked for 3 hours. It was not comfortable. It was honest, which is a different and more durable thing. He paid the check. I let him. I did not consider it a victory in the way that word is usually meant. Winning against your own son is not something a mother celebrates, but there is another kind of winning, where you refuse to be made small, where you hold the record of what is true, even when people around you insist on a more convenient version. That kind, I claimed, completely, without apology and without compromise. A year is enough time for a street to know you. By the following May, 14 Sycamore Lane had become a house. People noticed. Not grandly, but in the way of a place that is genuinely occupied and tended. The front garden was producing tulips in April, then lavender along the walk, then the climbing rose from Jim's cutting that had taken magnificently to the trellis beside the porch. I had put a bench under the maple, and on good mornings I took my first coffee out there before sitting down to work. My business had grown. The disruption of the previous year had, in some oblique way, sharpened my focus. I expanded into teaching small estate dealers how to build their own online systems, which pushed my monthly income well past its previous ceiling. I hired a part-time assistant named Priya, exceptionally organized, working remotely from Seattle. Carol and I had dinner every Thursday. Sandra had become a genuine friend. Dry humor, excellent sourdough, real patience. Jim coordinated the block's seasonal plantings and pulled me in as his co-conspirator, which suited me deeply. Maria's children still waved at me every morning from the bus stop. These were not small things. The morning coffee, the Thursday dinners, the children at the bus stop. These are the actual texture of a life. I had rebuilt what I'd sold in Boise and built something better. A home that was chosen. A community that knew me as myself. As for the house across the street, Daniel and Brittany separated in August. The hanging fern browned and nobody replaced it. Brittany moved to the Pearl District. The candle business did not follow her. Daniel stayed in the Craftsman house, and he and I had dinner every few weeks through fall and winter. The relationship of two people who had hurt each other and decided honesty was worth more than pretending otherwise. He started seeing a therapist and told me so directly. On his birthday, I made the German chocolate cake Harold had always made. He ate 2 slices and looked, for the first time in a long time, like my boy. There were evenings when I sat under the maple in the last of the light and felt something I can only describe as settled. Not triumphant. Settled. I was 69 years old, a house owned outright, a business running beautifully, a street full of people who knew my name, and a pothos in the kitchen window with 17 new leaves. Harold, I thought sometimes, look at what your careful woman built. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. Share this story, subscribe, and thank you for listening, dear friends.
오빠 매일 높아.
그래 위로 오자 그래.
아니요, 그 별거 없어.
씨.
또 이렇게 세워주시는데.
아이고 다리야 아이고 다리야 아이고 다리야 아이고 다리야.
잠깐만.
아이고 다리야 아이고 다리야.
잠깐만. 내위 좀 찍을게요.
아이고야 징배차를
에브킬711님 사랑해요. 별풍선 3개 감사합니다. 내가 지켜보고 있다.
이거 더.
ABC야 맞나?
광명.
요즘 자주 보인다.
31분.